They were left to die. A torn cardboard box on the edge of a frozen street. Inside, 10 golden retriever puppies, their tiny bodies curled up, barely moving. The snow kept falling. Their breath was fading, one by one, no food, no blanket, just frostbitten fur and silence. A garbage truck was getting closer, and still no one came. Comment, yes, if your heart can't bear the thought of them dying alone. In the small frostbitten town of Oak Ridge, Minnesota, the night moved slowly, dragging its shadowy silence across cracked sidewalks and shuttered windows. It was the kind of cold that whispered through the seams of houses, wormed its way through coats, and clung to bone. Street lamps flickered weakly against the weight of a storm that had rolled in the night before and refused to leave. And in that winter, in that stillness, nobody noticed the cardboard box sitting crookedly by the curb of Glendale Avenue. Except for Graham Merton. He was trudging home from his third consecutive graveyard shift at the bottle recycling plant, the muscles in his back aching, hands stuffed into a fraying canvas coat too thin for January. He walked with the sluggish steps of a man who didn't have anywhere to rush to. His beard, dusted white by frost, barely hid the lines etched into his cheeks, the kind of lines not carved by time alone, but by grief and the slow grind of poverty. Graham was 49, but carried the air of someone much older. His boots were cracked at the toes, laces tied together in mismatched knots. He wore the same gray beanie he had since the year his son died. The streets were deserted, not out of fear, but because people had the sense to stay warm inside, something Graham's house no longer offered. He had gotten the disconnection notice a week ago, 2 months of unpaid power bills. The heat had been cut last Friday. A single kerosene lamp now lit the kitchen. The rest of the house was a mosaic of shadows and cold silence. He didn't expect to find anything different in the night. He just wanted to get home, peel off the sweat-soaked thermal undershirt, maybe boil a can of beans if the gas line hadn't frozen. But then he saw it. At first, it looked like trash. A soggy, sagging cardboard box shoved beside a leaning stop sign. The snow had almost swallowed it. Only the warped edge stuck out. He would have kept walking, but something in the air shifted. Not a sound exactly, more like a vibration, a flicker of movement just inside his peripheral vision. He stopped, turned, took 2 steps back, crouched. The box was damp to the touch, brittle and reeking of old newspaper. He peeled it open slowly and stared. 10 tiny puppies, curled against each other like tangled socks. Their fur was matted and stiff with frost. Golden retrievers, maybe 4 weeks old at most. One lifted its head feebly, opened glazed eyes for half a second, and collapsed back into the heap. Another was breathing in short, stuttering gasps. They weren't whimpering. They weren't moving much at all, because it was too cold to cry. Graham's breath caught in his throat. He looked down the street, nothing but the shimmer of ice and the distant moan of wind. No tire tracks, no footprints. Whoever left them had done so in silence and shame. And now, a garbage truck was turning the corner at the end of the block, its headlights bouncing across snowbanks like blind eyes. Panic, sudden and irrational, surged through him. He scooped the entire box into his arms, the bottom bent inward, threatening to split. He pressed it close to his chest and began walking faster, boots slipping on the ice. The wind clawed at his face, but he barely noticed. His heart was hammering. His house, 4 doors down, looked darker than usual. A single candle flickered behind the kitchen window. He reached the porch and kicked the door with his boot until it creaked open. Inside, the air was barely warmer than outside. He shut the door with his shoulder, stepped over a laundry basket, and knelt on the living room floor. He laid the box down carefully, one side collapsing inward. The puppies barely stirred. The room was bare. No couch, no TV, just a sleeping bag on the floor, and a pile of worn paperbacks in the corner. The carpet was threadbare, stained with time and boot grease. The air carried a faint smell of damp wood and burnt metal, left over from when he had tried, unsuccessfully, to repair the space heater. He turned on the flashlight taped to the wall. Its weak beam trembled over the fur. One of the puppies made a soft sound, like air leaking from a balloon. Graham touched its side with 2 fingers. It shivered, almost imperceptibly. He pulled the old army coat from the hook near the door and laid it over the box. Then he grabbed the last clean towel from a milk crate and wrapped the smallest pup like a burrito. In the dim light, they all looked the same, little lumps of gold, barely alive. And Graham had nothing to give them. No electricity, no space heater, no puppy food, not even a warm floor, just his breath, his body, his time. He sat cross-legged beside the box, holding the wrapped puppy to his chest. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just listened. To the wind outside, to the faintest heartbeat against his own. Somewhere behind his ribs, a door cracked open. Years ago, there had been a boy in this house, Elijah, 6 years old when the heart murmur turned into something worse. The hospital bills had drained every savings account, every favor, and in the end, the boy died anyway, quietly, while Graham was parking the car outside. He hadn't made it in time. Since then, this house had been a shell. Since then, Graham had learned how to live with silence. But tonight, silence meant death, and he couldn't let that happen again. He looked down at the tiny face buried in the towel. Frost clung to its whiskers. Its nose was dry, cracked. Its little ears barely twitched. He could feel the weight of the box beside him. Too light. Far too light for 10 healthy pups. He knew the math didn't work. He didn't have money. He was already behind on rent, behind on food, behind on hope. But he had arms. He had heat. And for tonight, maybe that was enough. By the third morning, the temperature had risen only slightly, but it felt like spring inside Graham's chest. Scout had survived the night. She was still weak, trembling with every breath, but there was color in her gums again, a slight flicker in her eyes when he moved. That flicker, so small, so human, had been enough to keep Graham awake with gratitude. He hadn't thanked anything in years, but that morning he muttered something that might have been a prayer. The rest of the pups had started yipping, hungry and clumsy as they tumbled over each other. Graham had long since run out of broth, rice, or anything remotely soft. The crackers were gone. The last can of stew sat unopened on the counter, but he couldn't bring himself to use it. It felt like breaking the only rule he had left about dignity. So, he layered on 2 shirts, wrapped his scarf twice around his neck, and decided to make the walk to the flea market. The Oak Ridge Outdoor Flea Market, held in the south lot of a closed-down strip mall, was more scavenger camp than storefront. Plastic tarps flapped over tables of rusted tools, expired canned goods, and wool socks with mismatched toes. The meat stand at the far end was run by Hank Draper, a short, wide-shouldered man with a nose like a busted walnut and a permanent red hue on his cheeks. He had a reputation for being tight-fisted, and he liked people to know it. Graham approached, waiting his turn behind a man bartering for liver scraps. When he stepped forward, Hank didn't greet him. "I was wondering," Graham said, keeping his voice low, "if you had any leftovers, bones or trimmings. Nothing fresh, just whatever you were going to toss." Hank looked him up and down. "Didn't I see you in here last month?" Graham nodded once. "Well, it ain't a soup kitchen," Hank said. "You want something, you pay." "I don't have money," Graham admitted, "but I could work. Move some crates, help clean up after—" "Don't need help." Hank spat into the slush beside him. "Now move on. You're scaring customers." Graham didn't argue. He'd been turned away before. Still, the sting settled in his chest like a dull ache. He turned, pulling his coat tighter, and began walking away. He hadn't gone far when a voice whispered behind him, "Mister! Hey, mister! Wait!" He turned. A boy, maybe 12, stood behind a vendor table draped in old comic books and used toys. The boy had dark brown skin, shaggy hair peeking from under a knit cap, and the thinness of someone who had grown up used to skipping meals. His name was Noel. Noel Santiago lived 3 houses down from Graham. His mother, Maribel, worked part-time at the supermarket. Graham had seen the boy a few times, riding a dented red bike, kicking a half-deflated soccer ball in the alley, or walking home with his hoodie up and earbuds in. They'd never spoken. Now the boy extended a small grocery bag toward him. Inside, 2 ends of bread, a handful of broken crackers, and 2 slightly bent hot dogs wrapped in foil. "It's not much," Noel mumbled, "but you can use it, right?" Graham stared. "Where did you get this?" "My mom brings home stuff from the break room," he said. "I saved it. They were going to throw it out." Graham reached for his wallet, then remembered it was empty. "I can't take this for free." Noel shrugged. "You helped those puppies. I saw 'em. They're cute. One barked like a squeaky toy. Graham felt something stir in his throat. Thank you. Noel grinned, toothy and a little crooked. You remind me of my dad. If he was still around, only I think you're nicer. Graham couldn't respond. He just nodded and turned away, clutching the bag like something sacred. He made it back home just as the clouds darkened overhead. The wind had picked up again, dragging the scent of firewood and far-off traffic down the narrow streets. Inside, the pups swarmed him as best they could, half walking, half crawling. He tore the bread into small pieces, soaked it in warm water, and sliced the hot dogs into little medallions. He fed each pup slowly, murmuring their names, even though they couldn't understand, all except Scout. She wasn't strong enough to chew, so he mashed a piece into a paste and gently wiped it against her tongue. She blinked, weakly but with purpose. Afterward, Graham sank onto the floor beside them, his back against the peeling drywall. He stared at the ceiling, which had a new crack above the light fixture. He didn't feel the hunger in his belly anymore, only the weight of quiet hope. As the pups dozed off in a pile of twitching legs and tiny snores, Graham noticed something strange through the window. A man, parked across the street, leaning against the side of a black sedan with tinted windows, tall, with a wool coat and a cap pulled low, hands in his pockets. He didn't move, didn't look around, just stared. Graham stood slowly and stepped closer to the window. The man didn't flinch. After a moment, he climbed back into the car and drove off. Graham's stomach tightened. That car hadn't been on their street before. In a neighborhood like Oak Ridge, you knew every car. And something about the man's posture didn't feel like a neighbor's concern. He turned from the window, jaw tight, and looked back at the puppies, still sleeping, still innocent. He wasn't sure what that man wanted. But Graham had just found something worth protecting. The storm arrived without warning, as if the sky had simply given up, holding it back. By late afternoon, snow was already thick along the window panes, slapping against the plastic sheeting with icy gusts. Wind roared down the chimney like a wounded animal. The light outside turned blue-gray, and the streets vanished beneath a thick white shroud. Everything seemed to stop breathing, except the cold. Graham had seen winters before, dozens of them. He'd worked through blizzards, slept in rooms where frost formed on the inside of the windows, but nothing felt quite like this. Maybe it was the weight of responsibility. Maybe it was the 10 tiny lives depending on him. Or maybe it was the creeping dread of that black sedan from the day before. The electricity had been gone for over a week now. The cold inside the house was almost indistinguishable from outside. He had used up every candle, every dry towel, and every blanket except one. Elijah's old astronaut throw, now wrapped tightly around Scout, who still hadn't fully recovered. Her eyes fluttered open now and then, but she still barely moved. Graham had started burning anything that could catch fire. First, the stack of magazines under the coffee table, then the legs of an old stool, its screws clinking to the floor as he split it apart with a hammer. That morning, he had torn pages from a worn-out phone book and tossed them into a metal pot with rubbing alcohol, hoping for just a little more flame. But it wasn't enough. The roof had begun to leak near the back of the house. Water had dripped steadily onto the floor, leaving a dark spot that widened with each passing hour. The leak soaked through a cardboard box where he had kept his son's last birthday cards. He stared at them as the ink bled and curled, as if the paper couldn't bear to remember anymore. The puppies whimpered and shuffled, too young to understand what was happening, too fragile to fight it. Their fur had grown a little thicker, and they could now walk awkwardly, their paws slipping on the linoleum. Graham kept them huddled near the oven, where he had stacked a small barricade of books and table legs to feed the flames. But the warmth barely held. One of the pups, he'd named her Junie, the one with a white stripe on her nose and the softest ears, had grown quieter since morning. She hadn't eaten much. Her breaths came shallow, more like whispers than life. Graham held her for over an hour that night, wrapped in a kitchen rag, whispering to her over the faint crackling of fire. He tried rubbing her chest, stroking her paws, anything to stir her awake. Her body was so light in his arms. He remembered carrying Elijah home after his first surgery, how he had weighed just about the same. But Junie didn't wake up. She gave one last exhale, soft and warm against his thumb. And then, nothing. Graham didn't move. Not for a long time. He sat there on the floor with the other puppies nestled around him and cried. Not the kind of crying that filled rooms, the quiet kind, the kind that rusted the soul. Tears slid silently down his cheeks, disappearing into his beard. He hadn't cried like this in 20 years. Not since Elijah. Not since the funeral, where he couldn't look his ex-wife in the eye because he didn't have answers to anything anymore. The sound of knocking pulled him back. 3 sharp raps on the front door, barely audible above the wind. He opened it to find Lucinda Carraway, standing with a pink crocheted scarf wrapped 3 times around her neck, her cheeks red with cold. In her gloved hands, she carried a large silver thermos and a rolled-up extension cord tangled around something. "I saw the smoke," she said simply. "Didn't look like chimney smoke." Graham opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Lucinda stepped inside uninvited. She had a sturdy gait, a determined stare. Her dark green coat was buttoned all the way to the chin, and a brooch shaped like a cardinal glinted from her lapel. She looked around the dim room, spotted the pups, and softened just a little. "I used to raise beagles with my husband," she said, kneeling carefully, "before the heart attack took him. Never thought I'd miss those muddy paw prints, but there it is." She plugged the cord into a car battery-powered inverter she had pulled behind her in a plastic sled. Then she unfolded a worn electric heating blanket and laid it across the oven-side floor like she had done it 100 times before. The pups, sensing warmth, wobbled toward it instinctively. Graham stared, not knowing what to say. "I also brought hot water," she added, nodding to the thermos. "You can soak towels or warm their bellies." "Thank you," he finally said, his voice low. Lucinda glanced at the little bundle in his lap. "She didn't make it?" He shook his head. She nodded, lips pursed, and placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. Not for long, but enough to say she understood something he hadn't said aloud. For the next hour, they sat in silence. Graham tended to the remaining puppies while Lucinda mended a tear in her glove. The storm howled louder, but inside the house, a small island of warmth had returned. Before leaving, Lucinda turned at the door. "If you need anything else, blankets, soup, a phone call, I'm just across the street." Graham nodded. "I might take you up on that." She smirked. "I hope you do, for their sake." When she was gone, Graham looked down at the heating blanket now gently glowing beneath the puppies. Scout was curled up beside Benny, her breathing more stable now. Gus was snoring faintly, belly rising and falling like a heartbeat. Even Milo, the clumsy one, was nestled into the corner, his paw resting across Junie's empty spot. Outside, the storm screamed on, but inside, 10 had become 9. The loss was sharp, unfair, and final. Yet for the first time in years, Graham didn't feel entirely alone. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a silence that felt almost reverent. Snow coated the streets like a final breath held too long. Ice sparkled on the rooftops and telephone wires, beautiful and deadly. Inside the small house on Glendale Avenue, Graham sat on the floor, a mug of warm water in his hands, watching the puppies stir beneath the now lifeless heating blanket. Lucinda's car battery had given out hours earlier, but it had done its job. Scout was still breathing, and the rest of the pups were curled into one another like a living quilt. The spot where Junie had slept remained empty. Graham hadn't moved the small cloth he had wrapped her in. He wasn't ready. Maybe he wouldn't be for a while. Around 8 a.m., a gentle knock echoed from the front door. Not the sharp, demanding kind of the mailman or the unsettling rhythm of a stranger, but soft, unsure. Graham opened it slowly. Standing there, cheeks red from the cold and a press badge clipped to her jacket, was Emily Rhodes, a young local reporter from Channel 7. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with curly auburn hair pulled into a loose ponytail and wide, curious eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. Her coat was 2 sizes too big, cinched at the waist with a scarf, and she carried a camera slung over one shoulder like a second limb. "Mr. Merton?" she asked, polite but purposeful. "Emily Rhodes, local news. May I have a moment?" Graham hesitated. He didn't like cameras. He didn't like attention. But Emily's expression wasn't one of ambition. It was concern. Something soft but insistent. "I heard from a vendor at the flea market," she continued, "about what you did, rescuing the puppies. In this cold. They said, you didn't even have power." Graham gave a slow nod but said nothing. Emily shifted slightly on her feet. "I'd just like to ask a few questions. Maybe take a few shots. We run a community segment on good people doing good things. You don't have to say anything you don't want to. After a moment of silence, Graham stepped back and opened the door wider. Inside, Emily's expression softened the moment she saw the pups. They were awake now, yawning and stretching clumsily. Benny had found a spot in a bowl meant for Graham's oatmeal and was refusing to come out. Scout, weaker but alert, raised her head at the sound of Emily's voice. "You really saved them," Emily said quietly, almost to herself. Graham knelt, adjusting one of the blankets. They weren't loud enough to be found. That's the worst part. They didn't even cry. Emily pulled out a notepad. "Do you mind if I ask how you found them?" "They were in a box," he replied, beside a stop sign. Looked like trash. He told her the story, sparing few details. The ice, the cold, the moment he thought Scout wouldn't make it. He spoke with the caution of someone unused to being heard, but too tired to hide it anymore. As Emily knelt to photograph the puppies, her brow furrowed. She leaned closer to Gus and Milo, brushing back the fur behind their ears. She examined one more carefully, then another. "Did you notice," she asked slowly, "that some of them have markings behind the ear? Tiny scars? Almost like someone cut them?" Graham finished, voice sharp. Emily nodded. "It's not uncommon in underground breeding rings. Sometimes they tag or mark litters like inventory, especially if the pups are from a high-demand breed, like Goldens." Graham felt his chest tighten. So they weren't just abandoned. They were dumped, hidden. Emily sat back on her heels. It could mean someone's trying to cover their tracks. If they were part of a larger operation and something went wrong, heat from authorities, disease outbreak, they might have gotten rid of the weak or unsellable ones. "But they're just babies," Graham whispered. Emily nodded grimly. "And that's what scares me." She didn't ask more questions that day. Instead, she packed up slowly, giving Graham her card. "The segment will air tomorrow night," she said, "but I'll edit it gently. You don't come off as someone who wants the spotlight." "I just don't want them taken away," he replied. "They're safe here. They've got each other now." That afternoon, Graham received 5 phone calls, all from unfamiliar numbers. 2 were local rescue organizations offering to help. Food, bedding, temporary fosters. One was a woman who offered to adopt 3 puppies together as a gift for her niece. Another was a vet tech who asked about Scout and offered to come by with some antibiotics if needed. Graham didn't answer any of them. He felt the world creeping in again. Kindness, yes, but also eyes. Questions, decisions. Lucinda came by around dusk with a pot of vegetable soup and a stack of folded towels. She didn't speak much, just refilled the pup's water dish and handed Graham a plastic bag full of tea lights. As night fell, Graham stepped outside onto the porch. Snow had begun to melt, leaving puddles that glimmered under the streetlight. The same streetlight where he had first found the box. It looked so harmless now, so ordinary. But something had changed. Behind him, the puppies yipped and scrambled. Scout gave a faint bark, barely louder than a sigh. Inside those walls, life was beginning again. And somewhere out there, in shadows he couldn't yet name, someone had tried to erase that life. But they had failed. The new segment aired on a Wednesday night. It was short, barely 4 minutes, but powerful. Emily had edited it with care, choosing footage that highlighted the gentleness of Graham's hands, the vulnerability in the puppy's eyes, and the dim warmth of the house that had become their shelter. She didn't show the broken windows, the scorch marks where furniture had been burned for heat, or the empty shelves in the kitchen. But she didn't need to. The story told itself. By the next morning, Graham's porch was covered in bags of donated dog food, folded blankets, and envelopes with handwritten notes. Some included small bills. One note simply said, "You reminded me what kindness looks like." Graham didn't know how to feel. Grateful, yes, but also exposed. That same morning he noticed something odd. A white pickup truck parked down the street, facing his house. Engine running. The driver, male, mid-40s, square jaw, wearing a cap low over his eyes, sat motionless behind the wheel. Graham stared from behind the curtain. The man never got out. After 30 minutes, the truck rolled away. The next day, it returned. Different spot, same man. And then came the note, folded inside his mailbox, no stamp, no name, just one line written in jagged pen, "Mind your own business, or you'll lose more than a mutt." Graham read it 3 times before crumpling it in his fist. The weight in his chest returned, something colder than fear, sharper than anger. He called Emily first. She arrived in less than 20 minutes, wrapped in her overcoat, hair pinned in a messy twist. She listened quietly as Graham unfolded everything. The truck, the man, the note. Then she nodded and called the police. The officer who arrived was Deputy Kyle Renshaw, a clean-cut, broad-shouldered man in his 30s with sandy hair and a permanent furrow between his brows. He stood on the porch, arms crossed, as Emily explained the situation. "I understand your concern," he said eventually, "but unless there's evidence of trespassing or a direct threat to life, there's not much we can do. A note's just a note." Graham handed him the crumpled paper. Renshaw barely glanced at it before slipping it into his pocket. "I'll file a report, but if this is about some online drama from the story, it'll blow over." Emily's jaw tightened. "It's not online drama. There's something bigger here. I've been looking into it." Renshaw raised an eyebrow but didn't press. That night, the truck didn't return. But Graham didn't sleep. He sat up beside the basket of puppies, flashlight in one hand, a rusted crowbar in the other. The flames in the oven flickered, casting warped shadows across the walls. The next morning, Lucinda came over with a casserole dish and a strange offer. "My basement's half finished," she said. "Used to be my husband's woodworking space. It's warmer, safer. You and the pups can stay there, at least until we figure this mess out." Graham looked at her, surprised. "I can't ask you—" "You didn't," she interrupted. "I'm offering. Don't let pride freeze you out of common sense." By that afternoon, Graham had packed his few belongings, mostly old sweaters, a photo of Elijah, and a pile of towels, and carried the pups across the yard, one by one. Lucinda's basement smelled faintly of cedar and old varnish. She had cleared a corner near the furnace, laid out a rug, and even plugged in a small portable heater. The dogs explored quickly. Scout tried to clamber onto a wooden stool and failed, then barked once in triumph anyway. It made Graham smile for the first time in days. While the pups settled in, Emily knocked on the door again, this time with news. "I found something," she said, pulling out a folder. "There was a facility. Used to be a breeding kennel just outside Duluth. Shut down 3 years ago after multiple violations. Animal neglect, unauthorized sales. The owners disappeared before court proceedings. But someone reported seeing trucks behind the property last month. Big ones. No logos." She flipped open the folder, revealing printed photos, overhead satellite shots, a partial license plate number, and a blurry image of what looked like a loading crate. "I think the puppies came from there. The ear cuts, the age, the timing. It lines up." Graham felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Why dump them in town? Maybe the truck broke down. Maybe the buyer backed out. Or maybe, she paused, they thought if they left them in the cold, nobody would notice. Graham looked away. "They didn't count on someone like you," Emily said quietly. As she turned to leave, she added, "But be careful. If they think those puppies are evidence, they won't stop at a warning note." That night, Graham sat on a fold-out chair in Lucinda's basement, surrounded by the pups, watching their tiny bellies rise and fall with sleep. He had nothing but a crowbar, a flashlight, and a growing sense that whatever storm had passed wasn't the last. But now, he wasn't alone. The wind had died down, but the cold had not. In the dim orange glow of Lucinda's basement, the air was thick with quiet tension. Graham sat on the floor next to a space heater Lucinda had borrowed from her niece. Around him, the puppies slept in their usual pile, breathing evenly, warm and fed. Scout now walked without wobbling. Milo had discovered the thrill of chasing his own tail, and did it often, crashing into bowls and blankets. The others nipped playfully, no longer fragile bundles, but dogs in the making. But Graham couldn't sleep. Something about the note, the truck, and Emily's findings had carved unease into his bones. It wasn't just that the puppies had been dumped. Someone owned them once, someone who had seen them as inventory, not lives. And people like that didn't let things go quietly. That night, he kept the basement lights low. He unplugged the heater an hour before midnight to conserve power and sat listening to the stillness outside. Lucinda had installed a security latch on the storm door and given Graham a baseball bat that once belonged to her late husband. "Don't swing it like you're playing," she'd said. "Swing it like you're ending something." It was 2:37 a.m. when Graham heard the first sound, A click. Not from inside, from the small storm access door at the back of the basement. It was old, rusted, rarely used, but now it creaked slightly, like someone had tested it. Then, footsteps. Soft, but too heavy to be rats. Shadows blocked the faint light filtering through the snow-dusted glass. Graham stood, slowly, heart thudding. He moved toward the door, silently, bat in one hand, flashlight in the other. Behind him, the puppies stirred. One of them, Benny, let out a low, uncertain growl. Then a crash. The door slammed open, and a figure in a black hoodie lunged inside. Graham swung. The bat cracked against the wall as the figure dodged and shouted, "Get the dogs!" Another man appeared behind him, shorter, heavier, wearing a dark ski mask and gloves. "Quick! Get the damn box!" Graham yelled, instinct rising from some buried place inside him. He didn't feel the bat connect, but he heard the grunt and the sound of someone stumbling into the metal utility shelf. Cans clattered to the floor. Upstairs, lights flicked on. Lucinda, in a bathrobe and slippers, stormed down the wooden steps with a hand-crank flashlight and a garden rake. "I called the cops!" she shouted, voice sharper than her age implied. "You so much as touch those dogs and I'll break your teeth in alphabetical order." One of the intruders panicked and turned for the exit, but too late. A low snarl cut through the air. Milo, no longer a wobbling puppy, but a fast, sleek blur of gold, leapt forward with surprising force and clamped his jaws down on the man's gloved wrist. The man screamed. The other tried to drag him free, but Graham tackled him from behind, slamming both to the ground. Footsteps thundered from the front porch. Noel burst in through the unlocked main door, carrying a camera phone. "Emily's live!" he cried. "She's streaming everything!" Sure enough, behind him, Emily Rhodes pushed in with her phone in one hand and a pepper spray canister in the other. Her face was pale but focused. "I saw them pull up," she panted. "Started the stream the moment I saw them near the side gate. You're live right now. Everyone's watching." The intruders froze. Moments later, sirens howled down Glendale Avenue. Deputy Kyle Renshaw arrived with 2 other officers. The men were cuffed and dragged outside. Milo was still growling, fur bristling, tail stiff. Renshaw crouched beside Graham. "You okay?" Graham nodded. His arms were shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline. Emily handed her phone to an officer. "Everything's recorded. Faces, voices, the plate number on the pickup. It's all there." The man Milo had bitten was bleeding through his glove. Renshaw glanced at the wound, then down at the scar behind the man's ear. "Well," the deputy muttered, "looks like these guys were more than just thieves." By sunrise, the video had gone viral. Emily's stream had been picked up by 3 local networks and shared thousands of times online. "Elderly man defends puppies from black market dog smugglers," the headlines read. One called Graham the Quiet Guardian. Another dubbed him the man with the golden heart and golden dogs. Lucinda's house became a beacon. Rescue groups arrived with donations. A mobile vet set up a temporary clinic in a neighbor's garage to check the puppies. Milo, who had bitten the attacker, was declared healthy, brave, and slightly overconfident. But Graham stayed inside. The fame felt foreign. He wasn't a hero. He was just tired. He was a man who had once been broken by grief and somehow, through the silent loyalty of 10 abandoned lives, had found something to stand for again. Noel brought him a cup of hot cocoa that evening. Graham sat with the boy and the puppies in the warmth of Lucinda's basement, wrapped in donated blankets. "I'm glad you didn't give up," Noel said simply. Graham looked at him, then down at Milo curled in his lap. "I almost did," he replied. But then one of them barked, and the silence was gone. Spring came slowly to Glendale Avenue. It did not announce itself with blooming flowers or chirping birds, but with the steady melt of snow and the way sunlight finally began to stick to the sides of buildings again. The icicles outside Lucinda's house dripped like clockwork, and for the first time in weeks, the air no longer cut like glass. Inside the cozy basement that had become a sanctuary, Graham sat on a donated recliner, his feet propped up on a crate of kibble. The puppies, now 7 weeks old, no longer fit in a single pile. They had sprawled across the basement like an untamed golden tide. Scout sleeping belly up beside the heater, Benny chewing on the leg of a broken table, Milo barking at his reflection in a tipped-over baking pan. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. Since the attempted theft and Emily's viral livestream, everything had changed. Donations had poured in. Not just food and money, but services. A local contractor named Patrick Dell, broad-shouldered with a crooked nose and hands thick with calluses, showed up one morning and said simply, "We're fixing your house, no charge." Patrick had grown up in the same neighborhood, lost his own dog to illness the year before, and said Graham's story stuck something back together in me. So fix it he did. The roof was repaired, new windows installed, the walls insulated. Someone even repainted the door in bright cornflower blue, a color Lucinda insisted would make the neighbors less likely to frown. Through it all, Graham felt overwhelmed, not by the noise or the help or even the attention, but by something deeper, the permission to be cared for. It had been so long. The city issued him a special permit to keep all 10 dogs after a brief evaluation. The officer who came by, Janice Wilmer, a calm, middle-aged woman with thick glasses and a clipboard, was charmed within moments. "These dogs are safer here than half the kennels I've inspected," she said, kneeling to let Gus lick her hand. "And this little one," she nodded toward Scout, who was curled in Graham's flannel shirt. "She's the happiest underweight pup I've ever seen." The moment the paperwork was signed, Graham felt something in him relax, like the last bit of frost melting from an old window. Emily's long-form article was published in the Atlantic Weekly. It was titled, "The Man Who Stayed When No One Else Did." She had written it with tenderness and depth, exploring not just the act of rescue, but the soul behind it. She didn't shy away from Graham's past, his lost son, the years of loneliness, but treated it as part of the story's truth. The article received national attention. News vans came and went. Letters from strangers arrived in bundles. Some told him he was a hero. Some simply said, "Thank you for not looking away." Lucinda had, somewhat unofficially, become the grandmother of the house. She dropped by each morning with biscuits for both man and dog, helped fold laundry, and insisted on naming the runt of the litter Harold, after her late husband. She didn't ask for anything in return, except that Graham allow her to paint tiny flowers on the dog bowls. And he did. One afternoon, while Graham was sorting mail with Noel, who had started coming over after school each day, he found a plain envelope tucked between a magazine and a utility bill. There was no return address. The handwriting was jagged, unsure. Inside was a short letter. "You don't know me, but my son was part of the group that left those dogs. He was being used, paid to help, but too scared to say no. He's in juvenile now, but he's learning. Watching what you did, it made him cry. He told me he wants to do better, and I just wanted to say, thank you for saving what he couldn't, and maybe in a way saving him too." Graham read the letter twice, then a third time. He didn't say anything, but he quietly folded it, placed it inside a small wooden box beside Elijah's photo, and sat down on the floor among the dogs. They surrounded him, licking his hands, tugging at his sleeves, one climbing directly into his lap without invitation. Noel, watching from the corner, grinned. "You ever gonna name this place?" Graham looked around at the remodeled house, the warm lighting, the trail of paw prints across the new linoleum. He thought of the freezing street where the box had first been left, of Scout's shallow breaths, of Junie's tiny body in his hands, of Milo's growl, of Lucinda's rake, of Emily's courage. And then he smiled. "Family house," he said quietly. Noel blinked. "That's kind of simple." "It is," Graham replied, "but that's what it is now." That night, the porch light of 214 Glendale Avenue glowed like a beacon against the melting snow. A man sat inside, surrounded by golden fur, gentle noise, and soft, patient hope. He had no riches, no pedigree, no future he had planned, but he had warmth and love and the second chance he never knew he'd needed, and 10 names to call family. Sometimes the smallest lives are the ones most easily discarded. 10 helpless puppies left in the freezing cold, no one to cry for them, no one to wait for them. But then came one man, not wealthy, not famous, just a man with a broken past and a heart still willing to care. And through him, we saw it. God's quiet miracle, not in thunder or fire, but in warmth rekindled on a kitchen floor, in a puppy's breath against a grieving chest, in community rising where silence once lived. This story is more than about rescue. It is about redemption, about how love, when chosen in the hardest of winters, becomes a fire the world cannot ignore. And maybe, just maybe, that fire was lit by the hand of something higher. So, if you believe miracles can come through ordinary people, if you believe that compassion still wins, if you believe that God watches even the smallest of his creatures, comment Amen to honor the forgotten, the rescued, and those who never gave up. Share this story to remind others that kindness still changes everything. Subscribe to follow more true stories where love rewrites the ending. May God bless every heart that paused to listen.